Growing up, my parents set aside one night a week, as many families do, for a family night. At least I've known some families who do this, and this was what we did in our home. Growing up, the family would gather together one night a week to spend time together as a family, to have fun. And what great memories I have in my own family from those family nights. Perhaps some of you are building memories in a similar way. I can also remember in those family meetings, at least for a season, the clear presence of conflict during some of those family nights. And for some reason or other, it seemed that I was often at the center of the conflict that would take place on many family nights. And I wish, I was thinking about this week, I would love to be able to have some of these family nights on video, just to see all that took place and to see some of the joys, the high points and the low points of the family relating to each other. And there was one particular season, I was around 10 years old, and discussing conflicts from the prior week became a regular thing that we did in our family, at our family night. It was just one of the things that we would do. We'd get together, we would be talking about how we were getting along as siblings, and inevitably we would jump back into things from that last week on how we were getting along, conflicts that we were having. I shortly realized, we are spending each family night, and this is coming up, and I found myself, even as a 10-year-old, in family meetings where I was unprepared to have these discussions because I hadn't gathered enough information during the week, or things were being brought up that were catching me off guard. And so this is actually what I did. I started going around during the week with an actual pad and pen, keeping a literal record of offenses, keeping a record of wrong, so that I'd be going around, and as my siblings would do something that I didn't prefer or that seemed to be wrong, I'd whip out the pad and say, you'll be hearing about this. This isn't the last that you've heard from me on this. And then in family night, I would whip out that pad of paper and begin. So on Tuesday, I asked Sarah if I could use, her bike, and she said no, and she wasn't thinking of others. Mom and Dad, what do you think about that? I do the same thing with my brother. I asked Ryan if I could go to the store with him, and he said no, and he wasn't thinking of others. Sarah asked for this thing. When I said no, she whined. It was not a godly response, and I thought that you should know about that. And we laugh about this. Because my attention was completely focused on the weak points entirely. I was really uninterested in where they were pleasing God. Things they're doing well, don't care about it. I'm interested in the failures. I'm interested in where they are not obeying and where they're not pleasing God. And what I've realized, and this is sad, I've realized that same tendency to ignore God's activity in others and the positive things that He is doing, and to hunt for areas in need of adjustment, that same tendency remains with us as believers. It didn't leave me when I became a believer. Now, to a degree it did. But it remained with me, and the temptation remains with me to this day. Ignoring God's activity and focusing all our attention on making a big deal out of people's faults and weaknesses and sins. If they're loving God, if they're doing well, if they're growing, those things we don't care too much about or get too excited about. Where they're falling short, that's what we care about. That's what we make a big deal out of. I remember even as a believer in college, I took this approach to people, and some of my closest friends actually, somewhat jokingly, called me the hawk because I was always looking for sin. Not looking for sin in my own life, you understand, like a hawk. Looking for sin in others. Looking for the weak points in others. And I wouldn't hesitate to bring correction to people. So I was known for seeing weaknesses in others and not hesitating to bring correction to people. And I delighted in bringing correction to people. This is a part of the tendency that we all naturally have to overlook and to minimize all that God is doing in others, a failure to celebrate and to recognize God's activity in others. And it's one of the reasons that Paul's example in this text of real love, of real thanksgiving, once again proves so compelling to us. Because what I described myself as being in those early years, running around with a notepad, keeping track of all the wrongs that are being done, is the exact opposite of what you find in this man, Paul, in this text. Paul is a man who abounds with thanksgiving for the grace of God at work in others. He is a man who intentionally celebrates what God is doing in others. And nowhere do we see this more clearly than in 1 Thessalonians and in chapters 2 and 3 in particular. He is a man who is very grateful. He's a man whose life is overflowing with thanksgiving to God. Not only thanksgiving to God for having saved him. This is what we were singing about. It's the message of the gospel. God has given his only Son for us to die in our place so that when we look to him and rely upon him for our salvation from God's judgment, we are saved. That fills us with gratitude. That fills us with songs of thankfulness and praise. The blind that once covered our eyes has been removed. The veil has been lifted. And now we see the grace of God in Christ that we had never seen before. But a Christian is someone who not only sees that grace, we also see the grace of God in the lives of those around us. Our eyes have been opened up to see not just the objective message of the gospel, but that message of the gospel bearing fruit in the lives of other believers. Lives being changed and transformed by this message of the gospel. And it's what we see in Paul's example here. Thanksgiving is the dominant theme of this letter. I mean, Paul has already thanked God for them. He did it in chapter 1. He did it in chapter 2. And here he is in this third Thanksgiving section, added again, is essentially 3 entire chapters of thanksgiving to God. He's already communicated his affection. He's already communicated his love. He's told them that they bring him so much joy, and yet he must go on communicating these things. He just doesn't stop celebrating God's activity in these believers. In this passage, in these verses that we read, he's just received word from Timothy that these believers in Thessalonica are doing well. They are growing. They are walking in faith and love. You see that there in verse 6. But now Timothy has come to us from you and has brought us the good news of your faith and love. And he's also reported that they always remember Paul kindly and his team kindly and long to see them as they long to see them as well. So there was this affection, this warmth between them. It's one of the ways that we know that what we have in chapter 2 isn't a defense that Paul is building against criticism that they might have. He's just reminding them of his example among them. They felt very warm towards him. He felt very warm toward them, and his life overflows with thanksgiving. Here he receives this news from Timothy. Other Christians, these Christians who were on his heart, are doing well. And the question now that we're going to consider is, how does he respond? How does he respond to the news that other believers are growing in the faith? And how do we respond? How do you respond when you see God at work in others, or when you receive news that God is at work in others? How do you respond when you are made aware of the fruit of the gospel in other believers? Abounding in real love, living a life of love, means that you can't just be indifferent to it. You can't just say, okay, wait, they're doing well, that's great, and we move on from it, we ignore it. It means that you can't just say, that's nice and move on. It means that you can't just focus all your attention on the weaknesses and the areas in need of adjustment. There is a response that is required on our parts to seeing the grace of God, and we see that response through Paul's example in this text.